Hey guys, back with another video, and this time I want to cover hair dynamics and as a follow-up to all the hair related videos that I'm creating. And I've written about this, but let's dive into Blender to see how it's done practically. Okay, so here I have a very simple hair setup. I've just done some 10-minute combing to get this effect, and I want to show you how this works. Okay. Let me first enable children so you can kind of see how the hair looks. And if I were to press the spacebar and play on the timeline, you'll see that nothing is happening, and that's because we didn't enable any kind of physics calculations. Okay. Okay, and the way we can enable physics calculations is really simple. All you need to do is go to the hair particle system, the settings of the hair particle system. You have a little option called hair dynamics. If I expand this, you can see here there's a couple of grayed out options, but if I enable it with the checkbox, these options become editable. And we also get a new option called cache, which I will touch on real quick. Okay, so let's play and see what happens. Immediately you can see that the hair is moving and it's reacting to gravity, which is what we want. Okay, it is moving in a little bit of a weird bouncy way, but we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so being able to enable physics is the first step, but as you can see, the default behavior is not really what we want. You can also see a couple of issues here. It's kind of clipping through the emitter mesh, so that's a problem as well, but we'll deal with this one by one. So basically, let's look at the settings. Okay, here we go. The first setting that you can see for the hair particle system is the quality steps and the pin goal strength. And the quality steps determines how high quality the calculations will be. The higher this number is, the better your simulation is going to look. Let's play, and we can see that it's recalculating. You can also see it's a bit slower than it was before. That's because we increased the quality steps, so it has to spend more time to calculate. Okay, let's just bring this back down to 5. A good rule of thumb is to keep this at a low number until you're ready for the final simulation, and then you crank this up and you can put it to bake. It might take several hours depending on how complicated your hairstyle is and how complicated your dynamics are. But it's better to crank this up at the very end and just keep it low so you can keep testing and see how things go. The next thing is the pin goal strength, and you can think of this as sort of like a factor that determines how much the hairs are going to resist this simulation. Okay, they're going to just want to stay where they are, and that's the pin goal strength. So if I just crank this up as high as possible, you can see that they barely move at all. They just maintain their existing shape. If I go back, I'm going to bring this down to something like 1. Okay, you can see that they still move a little bit, but not much. If I bring this down to 0.1, they move, but they do resist. They roughly maintain their shape, and this can be really helpful if you've combed a perfect shape and you just want it to simulate, but you don't want to lose most of that shape. Let's say, for example, I wanted to maintain all this structure here. I could use the pin goal strength to force the hair to stay in this combed position and then simulate while still fighting and maintaining this position, like this, for example. So that's an option. For now, I'm just going to turn it off because I want to show the next settings. So the next setting we have here to control hair dynamics is the collision setting, the structure setting, and the volume setting. Now I'm going to focus mostly on the collision destruction, and I'll briefly touch on volume because I haven't done a whole lot of testing on the volume setting. So let's talk about structure first before we talk about collisions. Okay, structure is the setting that allows us to control sort of the material behavior of each strand. You can think of it like, okay, what exactly, how do these strands behave? What are the properties, the physical properties of these strands that cause it to either bend or stiffen or have weight? So we have a couple of settings. Mainly we've got a mass setting, which will determine how heavy it is. If I were to really crank up the mass, it's just gonna fall fast because it's just so heavy. Okay, a good value is 0.3. That's a pretty good value. Okay, and you can see here that it's really bouncing about. Okay, part of this is because of the stiffness value. So stiffness is like a value that controls how much bending there is. So if I had to increase the stiffness, basically what I'm doing is I'm increasing how stiff the hair is going to be. So it's very similar to pin goal strength. It'll have a similar effect at a very high value. If I were to bring it down, okay, a little bit, it'll have a really similar effect to the pin goal strength, as you can see. But unlike pin goal strength, this one has a couple of additional settings like random, for example. So we can, let's say, make 50% randomness. So there's like a random application of the stiffness. Okay, and you'll see that some hairs are stiffer than the others. Okay, and we can also crank this up. I'll just go all the way up. Okay. Now you might notice that you're not really seeing much change from this to the previous setting. Okay, and this is because of the fact that it's not caching anything. It's just using the same value. So sometimes if you just reset the quality steps, it'll just delete the cache, and that'll allow you to go back and like recalculate. And you can see now some of the hairs are completely not stiff at all, and some of them are really stiff, so they just maintain different kind of wildness to it. If I was to bring this all the way down, it'll have the same effect, but just much less hairs are affected by that randomness. But still, a decent amount of hairs are still affected, so that's that. Okay, the other setting that we can control is the damping. Okay, the damping will, if I were to play this just as it is, you can see there's quite a lot of bouncing going on. Okay, let's just reset this as well, and we'll reset. Okay, and you can see there's quite a lot of bouncing going on. That's because the hairs are bending a lot. Okay, and as they bend, they want to keep continuing in the bending motion. We can reduce this a lot using the damping. So damping is basically like, once it starts bending, how much is it going to resist the sort of the bending in motion? Once it started to bend, is it going to slow down the bending and make it stop? So you can see, just take a look here, bending a lot, bouncing about. We can really turn this down by increasing the bending. Let's turn it down a lot, to like 6. Okay, turn it up, I mean. And then immediately you'll start to see that yes, it is bending, but once it reaches a sort of state, once it reaches the bottom, it sort of slows down and stops bouncing about. That's what damping will do, because it still bends, but it just slows down the bending quite a bit. So you can think of the stiffness as a control of how much bending you want, and the damping is how much you want the bending to slow down and stop once it started to bend. Okay, and we can really turn this stiffness down to something like 0.35. We can even see even lower movements, and you can see that the hair kind of bends even further. but the damping is keeping things normal. If I would increase this back to its original value or decrease it, you can see that it just goes wild. It literally goes through the head and bounces all the way. So the damping can really help to keep the hair a little bit stable. Okay. Now the next setting I want to touch on is the collisions. Okay, and if you noticed, the hairs, as they fall through, they actually clip through the mesh here. They're clipping through, they're cutting through the mesh, and that's because the hairs don't know that they're not supposed to collide with this mesh. And the way we control that, okay, is through the collision setting. But before we do that, we've got to make sure that we excuse me, we got to make sure that we enable collision settings for this mesh. So the way we do that, this is really easy. All we got to do is go to the physics properties and then just click collision. That's it. Okay, and as soon as we do that, we are met with a menu like this. Let me just shrink this a bit, and you'll see a menu like this. Right now we don't need to concern ourselves with this particle setting. This is collisions for other types of particles, but this is more about concern with collisions of the hair. So it'll come under these settings. So right now I have changed some of these settings. I'm just going to reset everything. Okay, I believe this is how it was. Okay, and let's play and see what happens. Okay, immediately you can see that the simulation has slowed down. Okay, and you can also see that the simulation no longer clips through the mesh. In fact, the mesh is stopping the hairs from touching or clipping through, and that's really good. One way we can improve this is if we go to the collision settings. You'll notice that under the backend particle properties, under hair dynamics, collisions, you can see there's a couple of settings here. Number one is the quality. Now collisions too have a quality setting separate from the overall quality. So the overall quality is everything, but the quality of collisions is separate because collisions tend to cause a lot of problems and require a lot of processing power. Now the quality of 2 is definitely going to cause problems with a more complex hairstyle. You want something much higher than this, something like 25, 30, 40 even, if you want to guarantee that there's no weird behavior. But as you can see, if I was to raise this to say 25 or 20, okay, and then play, you'll see that it is so much slower because the calculations for this type of thing has increased dramatically. Okay, so let's just bring this back down to 2. The other setting is distance. Now distance controls like what is the distance at which this collision mesh will detect a collision from the hairs, so the default setting is 0.015 meters, but sometimes this is too thick. You might actually want to bring this down even further. The lowest possible value is 0.001, and I usually just press 0 and it auto clamps to this value, and that can actually speed things up because there's less calculations, because the hairs can now move a little bit closer. But as you can see, we do see a little clipping here, and that's because the collision quality is too low for such a tight margin. So you're gonna have to increase this, and then you'll start to see that this improves. Now we're gonna have to increase it even further. Okay, like I said, you need something like 25, 30, 40. So go for 35 for example. You might see significantly slower. We still see some. Okay, It's a bit better, but we still see some clipping, and this is partly because the overall collision quality has to improve. Okay, so the overall collision, overall quality steps have to improve as well. Okay, so let's just put this at 5 for now, just so that we can keep testing. My recommendation when it comes to quality steps is always to keep the quality steps low when you're testing, and then ramp it up before the final completion number. Okay, now that we have this, sometimes you might find a situation where the hairs just decide to explode. Okay, and this usually happens because when these hairs intersect with another collision object, like the head, for example, if you were combing and you combed and one of these hairs went inside this mesh for whatever reason, because you combed a bit too hard, then it's going to create huge problems. The entire hair thing can sometimes break, and it's just not going to behave the way you want. And the way you can sometimes deal with that is by using impulse clamping. Now, impulse clamping, basically what it does is, if, for example, this is so complicated, let's say you created a really complicated hairstyle that inevitably some sections, like for example this ear section, just collided like this, like a little bit collided through the ear. Okay, you could use impulse clamping by raising this value, and that will basically prevent excessive collision calculations in that particular area or overall, and this can help solve, you know, bad collision calculations. The downside of this is that it can also create inaccurate collisions. So you gotta find a balance. You usually start with something low and then keep increasing it until you get what you want. But the best case scenario is to try to avoid any kind of intersections with your mesh, and that should probably solve most collision problems. But if you can't avoid it, this is a good setting to adjust. And finally, we have the collision collection. So sometimes you want your hair to interact with another object. So if I was to add, for example, a cylinder, then shrink it down, and then just rotate it, shrink it down some more, shade smooth, put it somewhere here. Oh, okay. And just make it really small. Apply the scale, and I'm going to apply a collision setting on this as well. I'm also going to animate this slightly. I'm going to bring it closer to the hairs, and I'm going to, or maybe I'm not going to animate it, but I'll just bring it really close like this, and I'm going to just press play. Okay, and you can see, okay, as you can see, it's just some of the hairs just went over it, but you can see the rest of it is not going through, and you can see that there's a bit of a distance here, and part of the reason for that is because the collision distance is low, but also because this particular object, in the collision settings of this object, you can see the thickness, the outer thickness is quite high. So we can fix this by reducing that, and it'll come a little closer, and you can see now that it's working a bit better. But you can see some intersections. I think this is because when you look at this from wireframe mode, okay, hold on, maybe not wireframe mode, but let's when we look at it like this, I think it's because this distance is actually checking the distance between the origin point and the other object. So I think by increasing that slightly, we can slightly improve that. As you can see here, it improved dramatically. It doesn't intersect the cylinder as much. Maybe we can do it a little bit more, maybe 7. And this is how we can control it. Now let's say, for example, we wanted to intersect with a duplicated version of this, okay, but we don't want it to intersect with one. So what we could do is we could create a new collection. We could put this second one into the new collection, and in our hair particle system, what we could do is say collection number 2 is what's going to control, is going to be a collider. So you can see here collection 1 at 0 collisions, but collection 2 maintains its collisions, as you can see here. Okay, collision 1, even though this has a collider object, it's not considered for collisions because it's not in collection 2. Okay, so therefore it's not being considered for collisions. So that's really helpful if you want to, control a few things. I'm just going to delete both of these for now. We don't really need it. Okay. You could even consider, for example, creating objects to help comb the hair further by animating the object. That's also something you could try, but I haven't had particularly good luck with that, but you could give it a shot. Those are the sort of use cases for this, or you could just have it as objects that you want to collect in case of an animation that you're trying to create. And that's it. That's all there is to collisions. I'll come back to collisions in a bit, but I just want to give you a couple of pointers on that. But let's talk about volume. The volume setting is not something I use very frequently, but it is a setting that has the ability to influence the hairs in a slightly different way. So if I just play it right now, you can see here that the hairs are moving quite slowly. Okay, why is that? Let's just reduce the stiffness quite a bit, and let's just check it again. Okay, you can see here now I move the hairs quite a bit, and they move like this. By changing this air drag, we can actually slow down how the hair is falling a little bit. It'll slightly influence. As you can see, it's falling a little bit slower because what it's doing is it's trying to increase the air resistance. Okay, you can also increase internal friction. Let's start with 0.25, and this will just sort of increase the friction between the hairs, and create sort of a hair friction in between the hairs. This can sometimes help create a more realistic or different types of looks depending on the circumstances you're going for. As you can see, it is definitely improving things. And then the other thing you can do is or rather, this is not really the friction between the hairs, I think. Yeah, this is the friction between the hairs. Okay, and then another thing we can do is we can change the voxel grid cell size. Now this effect, this volume, it actually creates sort of a volume around the hair, and the volume has little cells, and this is the size of the cell. Okay, and by reducing this, you actually improve the quality of this volume settings because you're reducing the size of the cells, which means there'll be more interactions, but it'll also be much slower. Okay, and then you have the density target, which is the maximum density of the hair. So let's just put it to 13, for example. I think this should speed up the falling a little bit because the hairs are now more dense. Okay, and we can also have a density strength, which is the influence of the target density. So if I was to put something like this, okay, that's going wild because the density target is too high, I think. Okay, let's try that again with much smaller values. Nope. Okay, I think it's just because of the friction and the density target. So let's increase the density target and keep the friction a much lower value, maybe. No, that's still too high. 0.01. That's still too high. That's still too high, but maybe we can reduce the size of the voxel grid, and that might improve the simulation, but it will drastically increase the time it will take for the simulation. As you can see, you can get some weird effects. I think it's because of this. Okay. So when it comes to the volume setting, it's really a matter of experimentation, because sometimes you might find certain things are a little easier to achieve with the volume than it is to achieve with the other settings. But I mean, both of them have similar sort of features. It's just that instead of controlling the stiffness and the bending here, you can control the air drag, the friction between the hairs, as well as the density target of the hairs. Okay, so let's just bring this back down to 0. I think we can increase the friction this time, maybe. There we go. So we can increase the friction. We just have to keep the density strength to 0. And we can increase the friction some more. And you can have some interesting effects this way. As you can see, we can get some interesting shapes. Like, for example, this bending is very nice. And there we go. Okay, so that's all there is to hair dynamic settings here. But there is one last thing I'd like to talk about, and that is the fact that hair dynamics also comes with something called cache once you enable it. Now, when you're doing the testing, you might find that playing it like this is just a pain. So what you could do is you could cache it. So when you enable the when you expand the cache, you have a couple of options. The option here is just the list of cache, different caches that you've created. Let's give this a name. We'll call this bake_1. Okay, and then you can set the simulation start and end frames. This is mandatory. You have to do this. I've set it to 100, but I'll change it to 50 just to speed it up, or even 25 just to speed up this in case it's too slow. And then you can click on this bake button, and what will happen is it'll immediately start showing your progress bar, and it'll start baking. As you can see, it takes a little time, but once you have baked it, you can just play it back with normal speed, and you don't need to worry about it buffering or calculating each frame. You can just play it back and forth as much as you want because it's baked. Okay, and it only baked 25 frames, and you can see that by the red bar over here. Once I go past this, there's no calculation, so it just doesn't move at all. If you want to rebake it, you can just delete this bake and then bake again. Okay, there are some other settings like calculate to frame, so that'll just, you know, cache it up to here, but it won't bake it. It'll just cache it in the viewport. We can put current cache to bake, so if you played it, for example, when you played, it starts caching immediately. And again, we'll have to, so this bug happens where you have to reset the hair dynamics, so it'll just clear the cache. Again, if you just say, let's say 10, 9, really calculate the frame, will just start calculating from 0 to 9 or wherever you were. It'll just calculate that. and if you say current cache to bake, it'll just take whatever this is and apply it to the bake one. Okay, bake all dynamics means if you have multiple objects with hairs or any other physics, it'll calculate everything at once and bake it. If you want to delete all the bakes of all the objects, you can click delete all the bakes, and update all to frame will just bake or will cache all of the objects that you have in the scene. In this case I only have one, but if you had multiple objects, it will cache everything in this here. If you check disk to cache, you will right now it's caching everything into the blend file, but if you were to click this, it will cache it into a separate file, which can be helpful. And that's all there is for cache. To understand what cache is a really pretty basic setting. What I really want to show you is the field weights. Okay, and the field weights, as you can see here, is just a bunch of different sort of forces that we can control, like gravity, for example. We can reduce the influence of gravity, and when I play it now, gravity is significantly reduced. In fact, I'm gonna turn it to a minus value. Okay, now we have a minus gravity, which causes the gravity to move upwards. So now, as you can see, the hair is now moving in the opposite direction because gravity is now in the other direction. Okay, we can change the influence of gravity here using this setting, or we can just completely disable it by turning it off. There's also other forces like force, vortex, magnetic, etc., a bunch of different forces, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about those forces because there's a bunch of them, and I think I'll need a whole separate video to explain each one. But if I were to just take, for example, this wind force and then just rotate it, okay, and just put it this way, you can see here that this wind force, just increase the strength of it, and I'll just show you what happens. So the wind force will influence the hair, okay, by default, and you can immediately see the hair is being thrown back as if the wind is in her face. That's because the direction of the wind is towards her face, as I put it, and it kind of pushes her hair back that way. Okay, so that's what this wind force can do, and there's a whole bunch of other forces that you can explore and try and set the settings of. Maybe I'll make another video on another day where I explain all the forces, but today is not that day. And you can control the influence of these on your hairs by turning this on and off. So if I were to turn it off, the wind will no longer affect the hairs. It'll just fall. It won't do anything because there's no gravity and there's no wind. So let's turn gravity back on. You can see it's just no longer affecting at all. Sometimes you might want to selectively affect things. For example, I have put the wind in this collection and I want to make sure that it affects only the forces inside of this collection affect this hair, and I can do that with the effector collection. So any force that's inside of this collection will affect, any force outside of this collection will not affect this hair, and we can still selectively control it over here as well. So there's interesting ways you can change the dynamics. Sometimes you might want to add in a force to help control how the hair is being affected, and you can even have multiple forces, but the force will affect based on it'll accumulate both forces and effect. So if you just take a look here, this is what's going to happen. You can see the hair is actually moving in backwards and sideways at the same time because the forces are intersecting, and you can see there is a certain section where the forces are sort of intersecting with each other over here, and the hair is just trying to move in the direction that satisfies both forces. So whichever force is closer tends to have the most effect. Okay, if I would move this away, the closer force will have greater effect. Okay, than the further away force, and that's how it is. But both forces will still affect, and that's how we use forces. Oh, I want to mention one last thing about collision settings. Earlier I mentioned that when it comes to collision settings, a lot of the time some of you might have really weird problems, and 99% of those are going to be caused by collisions. Especially, for example, if you use my normal method of using a scalp object to interact and make this a collision object, sometimes when you're combing you can intersect the hair with this collision object, and that can create a lot of problems. You can also have various kinds of intersections with collision objects, and that's what's going to cause most of the problems. Sometimes you can clear those problems with impulse clamping, and sometimes you just need to comb the hairs to make sure that they don't intersect. The best solution is to avoid intersections. So you got to be careful when you're combing the hairs in particle edit mode to make sure that there is no intersection. Otherwise you will 100% cause catastrophic problems to your hair grooms, and it can be really difficult to manage. And if you're really lost, just delete the whole edit and just start over. So that's it, guys. That's all there is to know about hair dynamics. In a later video I will explain how each of the forces work, but before that I'd like to eventually get to creating a hairstyle completely from scratch on video and show you guys how I do it, and all the mistakes and trial and error that goes into it, and also the bugs. Okay guys, that's all I have for today. I'll catch you in the next one.